Welcome to the first episode of Reef Restoration Conversations. I'm Kailash Cook, and joining me today is Nathan Cook. Nathan has pioneered reef restoration in the Great Barrier Reef. So today we're here to talk about your Whitsundays Reef Restoration and Public Art project, right? Awesome. So this is obviously taking place in the Whitsundays region, right?
Yeah, so the Whitsundays region of the Great Barrier Reef, the central part of the Great Barrier Reef. There was a cyclone in 2017 that severely damaged a lot of the reefs in the Whitsundays region. So the project came about to try and see if we could implement activities that could improve the health and resilience of these reefs at local scales that were really important to the local tourism industry. And we settled on two locations, one at Hayman Island called Blue Pearl Bay and one at Manta Ray Bay on the north of Hook Island. So these two locations were heavily degraded, down to less than 5% coral cover in both locations. Lost a lot of diversity, so a lot of the large massive colonies survived, but there was a lot of the branching acroporids and other complex species had been stripped off the reef. And so these were target locations that the tourism industry were previously frequenting, and we wanted to try and improve the health of those locations. So back to your question, where do you find coral? So we did a bunch of surveys around the region nearby to try and find places that weren't heavily degraded, that still had adequate coral cover. When we collect corals, we do surveys of the reef beforehand to make sure that there is sufficient coral cover at that location so that we're not going to do further damage by taking coral from those source locations. Our primary source location for this project was Whitehaven, Stonehaven, which is a reef flat, and then it drops away quite a lot to deeper water. Really strong currents moving through there, and quite good coral cover, quite a bit of diversity. And with the corals, when we collect them, one of the things we try and do from a climate change resilience perspective is preferentially choose larger colonies that have survived the most recent bleaching events. So the most recent bleaching event wasn't that long ago in Australia, 2016 and 17. Many of the reefs in the GBR bleached heavily. And so by preferentially choosing larger colonies, we're likely to get those that are more resilient to some of those warmer temperatures.
So you have this coral that you've picked up from Stonehaven that survived all of these impacts. What do you then do with it?
We prioritised what we would consider fairly basic coral gardening methods, been used around the world for over 25 years. And this is taking cuttings or fragments, not dissimilar to something like these. And these tend to be often loose on the reef. We call them corals of opportunity. And they will roll around in the sand and potentially get abraded and die if you don't give them a stable base. So there's a 50-50 chance that they will survive. We take corals of opportunity, but we also take donations from living fixed colonies. And the reason we do that is to increase the diversity of our source corals. If you don't take from a lot of the source corals, like if you don't actually actively break some of those fragments off, what you end up with is a lot of the weaker colonies that break easily. Because they preferentially break easily, they're the ones that you tend to get, and you limit it in the diversity of your source colonies. So we don't do that very often, but it is done just to increase that diversity of species. We work with lots of different species, so we've probably got over a dozen different species from at least half a dozen different families. Predominantly Acroporidae, or Acropora, the branching species, which were heavily degraded from a lot of these reefs. But we use, other foliose or massive species to grow the corals on our nurseries. And we use a two-step process when we transplant them. So we collect our corals from the source locations and we transplant them onto coral nurseries. These are locations that we can grow, rear, look after the corals for 6 to 12 months until they're big enough, strong enough, have demonstrated resilience, and we can outplant them onto the surrounding reefs. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so it sounds a bit like the way you described it, a bit like gardening. So you're going around and just taking little cuttings of coral, or just finding them lying around on the ground, and then bringing them over to your restoration area and growing them in these, did you say fabricated trays that you've made?
Yeah, so we have two methods of nurseries. One's called rope nurseries and one's a table or a tray. And we use these, for the table method, we use these concrete discs that we make before we head out. You can use them like this, as a little bit smooth, or you can use this rough surface. And we often cure these by leaving them in the water for a little bit before they get coral planted in them. When we attach them with adhesive or an epoxy of some sort, and plant the corals in these, and then they go on the tables to grow. So we're giving that coral of opportunity a solid base from which to grow and become a bit stronger. One of the reasons we've used this coral disc method in the Whitsundays is the Whitsundays is subject to heavy sedimentation, and a lot of the reef substrate is covered with a thick layer of sediment and turfing algae. So if we were to transplant corals directly onto that reef substrate, the likelihood that they might get smothered and compromised by that thick layer of sediment is high. And so we're trying to give them this buffer between that sediment and a place to grow. So they stay on the nursery like this for 6 to 12 months, and then we take that coral disc and we plant it out on the reef. And we use cement to do that. We mix cement on the boat and we deploy it using a caulking gun. So like a regular caulking gun you might use for silicone, I've spoken to other practitioners around the world who have used piping bags to make like icing of cakes, and they find that being the most efficient method for them. And I've spoken to them about these caulking guns and they said no, it didn't work for them. Well, these have been amazing. Like, just allows us to fill them, deploy, and you can probably get about 20 corals out of that one caulking gun. So you have a team on the boat that will be making cement and passing this down to you in the shallows as you're out planting the corals.
So the team on the boat is up there mixing cement and then filling the caulking guns with the cement, and then you're deploying that cement under. Does normal cement mixture cure underwater?
We actually add admixture to it. In Australia we use bondcrete. I know in the Seychelles they used sicacrete. You can get silica, microsilica particles. So what you're trying to do is add something that's going to increase the viscosity so that it can cure quicker and make a solid attachment. And so when we plant them out on the reef, you can't do it in high dynamic environments or when it's really rough, because the potential for the cement to wash away. But they get pretty solid within about half an hour, and by the next day they are immovable. The other method I've spoke about earlier was rope nurseries, and so we actually embed corals fragments in ropes and suspend them between a frame. With this, the rope that's embedded inside the coral will grow around that rope, and that will stay inside the coral skeleton.
So when you say embed in the rope, does that mean like the rope has those little, is like twine, so you're untwining the rope and then sticking the coral in the frayed rope kind of thing?
That's right, so in between the strands of the rope.
Ah.
And so it'll grow on that, and when we transplant them onto the reef, it's a tricky process because people often criticise the fact that you're putting this artificial substrate materials into the reef. And we did trial biodegradable rope, in the hope that it would stay intact for 12 to 18 months, but the biodegradable rope did exactly what biodegradable rope should do, and it biodegraded, but it happened very quickly, so it wasn't very efficient. Tried a couple of different types of sisal and manila, but neither of them were effective, so we've had to go back to polypropylene and other hemp materials to try and see if we can get an effective method. So far this has worked really well, and we take the rope off the nursery when we outplant them onto the reef, and we lay the rope over the reef substrate and we nail the rope to the reef. People say, yeah, but you're leaving all that rope there. And yes, temporarily we are. The intention is that if you nail the rope to the reef and it's tight, those corals will grow and make their own self-attachment to the reef, and over time we'll be able to go back and trim the excess rope so that it's not left in the environment.
Okay, so let's just clarify, you've got these two methods, and from the sounds of it they work pretty well in the nurseries. So like you've got the cement discs growing on the trays and then those corals suspended in the ropes, and they all survive pretty well, right? Because they're in the controlled environment, like still in the ocean, but they're in this area that's raised, that's not subject to as much sediment, there's not as much ocean movement, and then you're taking them and putting them out onto the natural reef. How does that go? Are the corals strong enough to survive then, or do you face some challenges there?
There's challenges at every step of the process. The nursery helps us define some of the resilience, and as I mentioned, this pilot project has trialled some innovative methods. We were trying a silicone adhesive for the corals inside the coral discs, and that proved not very helpful for the corals. It was quite toxic, and we had quite high mortality when we did that. So we've stopped using that. The biodegradable rope was not very effective, so we've stopped using that. And so we're refining and improving our methods, and we're also finding out which corals are more resilient in that environment. So that's at the nursery phase. When we put them out on the reef, the challenges that we've faced, we've had heavy predation from bumphead parrotfish.
Sorry, what? Bumphead parrotfish?
So bumphead parrotfish eat the algal cover of corals, but they'll also prey on live coral colonies. And we think this is because there's so limited branching colonies that are their preferential, prey target, that when we plant them out on the reef, they go woohoo, and it looks like mealtime. So we've had heavy predation from some of the bumphead parrotfish, which has been a real challenge. How you stop it, I'm not sure. I haven't seen any bumphead parrotfish in my time there, so it's a really tricky one. We had additional bleaching about a year ago, which did knock out a bunch of our corals, both on the nurseries and on the reef. And there's some seasonal algal blooms that are smothering and overgrowing our outplanted corals, so that's been quite challenging. And I talked already about the heavy sediment load in the Whitsundays. I think the Whitsundays is just going to be a bit of a slow burn as far as restoration goes. You don't have that clean outer reef water with high turnover of nutrients. I think it's just one of those places that might be not as fast in developing.
The Whitsundays region is in the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon, correct?
Yeah, it's in the lagoon, but it's a near-shore reef, and near-shore reefs tend to be represented by often higher macroalgal loads, higher sediment loads, and sometimes poorer water quality, which is quite common on the near-shore reefs of the GBR. One of the other novel techniques we've been trying for some individual outplanted colonies, so some of the rope nursery corals, when we do trim the ropes, for added stability, we've been using a device that was invented by some friends of ours up in Port Douglas, wavelength reef cruisers, called coral clips. And the coral clip is a nail with a steel arm that is flexible. So if I can show you that. And the intention is that you hammer the nail onto the reef and you place the coral under this downward pressure of the arm of the coral clip, and it holds it stable there. And the intention is that if it's stable for long enough, the coral will make its own self-attachment to the reef. This is a great method, really easy to deploy because you just need a few of these and a hammer, no messy mixing of cement and caulking guns and other things that you need to do. So these have been really good. I've had mixed success with these. Many dislodgements and corals that are not being held, but I've also had quite a bit of really positive success where they've held the coral, it's made its self-attachment and just grows over the nail, so that gets embedded in the coral skeleton. We use these a lot when we're doing monitoring and maintenance trips. When we're not going for a dedicated outplanting, we'll take a bucket of coral clips and use these to attach to the reef.
So, just clarifying, is that metal arm, like, it looks spring-loaded, so it's got that downward force pushing against the coral and keeping it connected to the substrate. If that's the case, then how is there dislodgement issues? Is there just not enough downward force, or what's going on there?
So this is a really ingenious invention because the little bend in the arm allows you to wedge small fragments under the first bit and bigger pieces under the second bit. What you were talking about with dislodgement is it has a downward force, but if it's pushed up for long enough, it's going to lose that strength over time. You also have animals that prey on the corals, not necessarily the bumphead parrotfish, but you get things like wrasse who try and eat the little invertebrates that live amongst the coral colony. So they can pinch at the colony, and if it's not stable, it can get dislodged. And you might have some dynamic weather forces too, which may play a part, but that would be less of a concern or an influence on these, I think.
What has worked well then? So you've been talking a lot about the challenges. What are some of the success stories? Have you got some areas where the coral has had enough time to grow and turn into like a young reef?
There's been some really exciting results. Some of the corals are definitely starting to have an effect, transforming what was previously bare reef substrate into coral-dominated environment. They're starting to make their own attachments to the reef, and it's starting to look increasingly more diverse than it was before. So that's been really exciting. Last year when we went to do some monitoring, a couple of our really well-developing colonies, one particular Possilopora colony, number 25, and a Hydnophora rigida, number 80, couple of my favourites. They were damaged, looked like it had been predation, and they'd been smashed into lots of different pieces, which was, yes, disappointing, but what it actually did was the process of coral gardening in a natural sense. We took many of those fragments and replanted them on the reef around those colonies. When I was back there recently, all of those little bits that were broken are still alive and growing well. And because they came from the same colony, there's the potential that if they grow big enough, they will actually fuse back together and make a large colony. Not unlike the methods that were pioneered by Dr. David Vaughan in the Florida Keys and other practitioners, where they do a process called microfragmentation, so breaking the same colony into lots of little pieces, growing them individually and having them fuse back together to make a larger, more mature colony quicker. So that's really exciting to see. Seeing them self-attach to the reef and make their own attachments and becoming an integral part of that reef community, that's been really exciting. But I think the biggest success of this project has been the social outcomes. The engagement with the community and the local tourism industry. Surveys that we did studying some of these outcomes suggested that 96% of people were inspired by being involved in the reef restoration activities, which is pretty exciting. And you see the passion and enthusiasm that people have when they're out there. We know that these are methods and techniques are not the solution to the health of coral reefs around the world, But they can be really effective in small scales, and we're starting to see the changes from 2.5, 3 years of work now. And hopefully by sharing some of these stories, we can inspire people to not only be involved in activities like these and restoring small patches under a reef stewardship program, but it might also encourage people to undertake actions that can support the health of reefs on a global scale by mitigating the effects of climate change through behaviour change at home, but also voting for governments that are going to do more about reducing carbon emissions.
I was going to say, just sitting here listening to you talk, I've learned so much about coral reefs that I never even thought would occur on this planet. So with all that social aspect, that's really cool to see that that's having such a big influence. Is there any plans to, do you involve volunteers or paying customers to come and help out and learn about all of these different methods and get involved, like you were saying, or?
We have run a number of trips now where we engage people in the activities of restoration, and it's been really cool because they've been sort of a bit impromptu, like what do we need to do this time? Oh, we need to actually go and outplant these corals that are already mature. So last year during COVID, when the tourism industry was pretty much laid off work and weren't doing much, we got 38 members of the tourism industry and local community out involved in the process of helping us outplant the corals onto the reef, and they have that sense of ownership on those locations and can share that with the people that they take out to the reef going forward. We run an annual reef restoration and leadership workshop at Orpheus Island every year, which has been, this will be our 4th year, and so that's been really exciting as well to have that opportunity to share that information and knowledge. And yeah, we're always limited by funding to a certain extent, but we're trying to provide, empower local community, especially, we've had quite a bit of engagement with traditional owners and Nauru people in the region, so it's been great to have their participation in the reef restoration activities as well.
Good to see you're getting so many people involved. Well, hopefully with that the project will inspire some changes in the social mentality of people towards climate change and the coral reefs for years to come.
That's the hope. Yeah, that is the hope.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Nathan. That was really, really inspiring to listen to, and I wish you all the best for your project, and I'm really looking forward to see where it goes from here.
Thanks.